The Watcher of Briar Hollow, Chapter 1, The Alarm. April 3rd, 2023, 1:43 a.m. The cold in Briar Hollow was the kind that crept inside your bones and whispered to your nerves. Wind clawed at the edges of the cracked sheriff station windows, whistling low like a warning no one wanted to hear. Deputy Eliza Monroe was halfway through a stale cup of coffee when the radio crackled. Then came the chime. Briar Hollow Youth Camp Perimeter Alarm. Zone, Kitchen. Time, 01:43. Her heart sank. Not again. The camp had been hit 5 times in the last 2 months. Food stolen, utensils gone, propane tanks vanished. Each time the intruder left no tracks, no prints, not even a single snapped twig. Locals whispered of him, the one who lived in the woods, the one who watched from just beyond the trees. They called him the Watcher. Eliza slid her revolver into its holster, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped into the icy blackness. The road to the camp twisted like a dying snake, swallowed by thick woods that hadn't seen light in generations. The trees leaned too close, like they were listening, and Briar Hollow never listened quietly. 1:59 a.m. Campgrounds. The headlights of her cruiser illuminated the date. No movement. She stepped out slowly. The ground was frostbitten. Her boots crunched on ice-glazed pine needles. The kitchen building stood in the distance, dark, silent, but the sensor had gone off. Something was in there. She reached the back entrance and saw it. The lock was scratched open. Inside, her flashlight beam sliced across overturned pans and open cabinets. There, near the fridge, stood a figure. A man, medium height, ragged clothing stitched from patchwork gear, a long coat too big for his frame. His face was pale, almost waxy, framed by a hood and shadowed by a beard that looked oddly well trimmed. He didn't flinch. He just stared at her like he'd been expecting her. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. "I never was." Eliza raised her flashlight. "Who the hell are you?" The man blinked. "I'm no one, just someone who stayed too long." She noticed something off. His eyes, they were clouded, not with cataracts, but with something else, like the forest had stared back at him too long and left a mark. He didn't run, he didn't fight. When she cuffed him, he whispered, "It's waking up. I tried to keep it quiet." "What is?" Eliza asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You'll understand soon. It doesn't like to be forgotten." 2:47 a.m. Sheriff's Station. They booked him under the name Caleb Rourke, but he had no ID, no birth certificate, no record of existence for over 30 years. His fingerprints came up blank. His backpack contained only the essentials: protein bars, water bottles, a rusted knife, and a journal. Eliza flipped it open. Inside were crude drawings of the woods surrounding Briar Hollow. Strange symbols marked trees. Others were sketches of faces, elongated, featureless, black, yawning mouths. The final page held a single sentence: "I stayed to keep it fed. Now it wants more." Later that morning, Eliza stood in front of the holding cell. Caleb sat motionless on the bench, and his eyes stared at the wall like he could see something through it. "You're not a thief," she said quietly. "Not really." He chuckled, dry and brittle. "Thieves take for themselves. I took for survival. But it takes because it wants to be remembered." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked up at her, and for a moment she saw something move in the depths of his eyes, a flicker, a shimmer, like oil on water. "You'll understand soon. It doesn't like to be forgotten." That night, the town of Briar Hollow slept uneasily. Dogs barked at nothing. Radios picked up whispers. And deep in the woods, in the old clearing behind the hollow's edge, the trees began to breathe, and something stepped out. Chapter 2: The Boy Who Disappeared. August 14th, 1987. Briar Hollow had always been a quiet place. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet. It was the kind of town where trees outnumbered people 100 to 1, and the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. People learned to whisper in Briar Hollow. Speak too loudly, and the woods might hear you. That summer, Jacob Morris turned 15. A wiry kid with a mop of red hair and a restless spirit, Jacob hated the town. He hated the way the fog rolled in off the lake and how the locals always locked their doors before sunset. Most of all, he hated how everyone tiptoed around the woods like they were some kind of living curse. Jacob wasn't afraid, at least not then. His mother had begged him not to go out that day. "You stay on the trail," she warned, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "And don't go near the hollow." Jacob had rolled his eyes. The hollow was just a patch of trees behind the old campgrounds, a place local kids made up stories about. They said you could hear voices there, that you'd see lights dancing between the trunks, that people went in and never came back. Stupid, he thought. Just stupid stories. But that afternoon, he didn't return home. When the sun dipped below the trees and Jacob was still missing, search parties were formed. They scoured the trails, the lake, even the rocky ridges beyond town. For 2 weeks, over 100 volunteers picked through the forest with dogs, flashlights, and desperation. Nothing. No clothing, no blood, not even a footprint. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. One man claimed to have seen him. An old trapper named Willard Kane came stumbling out of the woods 3 days into the search, white-faced and trembling. He said he saw a boy near the hollow, walking alone. But it wasn't him, Willard muttered. It looked like him, but it wasn't. When pressed, he only said one thing. He smiled without moving his face. No one believed him. Or maybe they did, but belief came with a price. After that day, Willard stopped speaking to anyone. He boarded up his home, abandoned his traps, and drank himself into silence. He died 5 years later. They found his body by the edge of the woods, his face turned toward the trees, eyes wide open, smiling. Jacob's disappearance became the town's great unspoken wound. His mother withered under the weight of it. His father drank until the days bled into each other. His room remained untouched for decades, a time capsule of posters, comics, and a telescope pointed at the window. The official story said he was lost to the forest. An accident. Nature reclaimed him. But the kids in Briar Hollow, the ones who whispered by flashlight during sleepovers, they knew better. They said Jacob never left. They said he was still out there, watching, waiting, changing. Present day, 2023. Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat on her porch, a wool blanket over her legs, eyes fixed on the black stretch of trees beyond her backyard. Briar Hollow never changed. The same wind, the same hum beneath the silence, the same feeling that something out there was listening. She kept thinking about what Caleb Rourke had said. I stayed to keep it fed. What the hell did that mean? She'd read his journal, every page. Some were nonsense, scribbles, frantic lists of items stolen, dates that meant nothing. But in between the madness were stories, observations, descriptions of things that sounded impossible. Eyes between the trees, a woman made of mist, a creature with no mouth, only hands. Sounds like children crying, only when followed, nothing was ever found. Then she saw it. Near the back of the journal, a name: Jacob Morris. The entry was dated August 13th, 2002. Saw the boy again. Same age, same clothes. He hasn't aged a day. He watches from the hollow, where the shadows are thickest. I think he's the first one it took. Eliza felt her blood chill. Jacob would be over 50 now if he were alive. But Caleb had written about him as exactly as he looked when he disappeared. As if time had ignored him. Or something had. Eliza closed the journal and stared out at the woods. She didn't believe in ghosts, or at least she didn't used to, but if what Caleb saw was real, if Jacob was somehow still out there, then this wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about what the Hollow kept and what it was preparing to give back. Chapter 3: The Vanishing Trail. 2 days later, Briar Hollow Sheriff Station. The morning fog had rolled in thick, blurring the trees into ghostly outlines. Deputy Eliza Monroe stood in the records room, surrounded by old boxes filled with water-stained reports and half-forgotten evidence. The station had a file on Jacob Morris, one slim folder with a few photos, some witness statements, and a final scrawled note. Case closed. No body. No answers. But Jacob wasn't the only one. As she read, Eliza found patterns buried beneath the dust of time. Between 1972 and 2010, 11 people had vanished in the woods surrounding Briar Hollow. Some were hikers, others were locals. One had been a firefighter checking a dry path for brush fire risk. Another was a school teacher out for a morning jog. No one had ever linked the cases. Until now. Each case happened between August and November, and each one occurred near the Hollow. There were photos, grainy, color-faded snapshots of lost faces, smiles caught in frozen time. But what struck Eliza most was how similar the disappearances were. Always quiet, always clean, never a body, no blood, not even a shoe print. Like they had evaporated or been taken. Later that day, Caleb's journal, entry September 9th, 2005. It whispered my name again today, from the hollow trunk, near the stones. It was my mother's voice, but she's been dead 20 years. It lies. It always lies. Sometimes I hear them walking at night. Not animals, not people either. Something in between. They don't breathe, but I feel them watching. It showed me his face. Jacob, still 15, still smiling, but the eyes were wrong, like glass, like something was behind them wearing his skin. Eliza drove out to the campgrounds. The director, an older woman named Marianne Vickers, met her with a tight expression and bloodshot eyes. "You're not the first," Marianne said, "but you're the first one asking the right questions." "What do you mean?" Eliza asked. Marianne hesitated, then glanced toward the woods. "Caleb didn't steal from us for food. Not entirely. He left things too. Things we never asked for. Dead birds, carved stones, hair. Once he left a bundle of feathers and teeth wrapped in old newspaper." Eliza raised her eyebrow. "Why?" "I think he tried to protect us, or make some kind of deal. You see, Caleb believed something lived out there, something older than the forest. He thought it needed to be kept asleep. Fed," Eliza murmured. Marianne nodded. He wasn't wrong. Same evening, the edge of the hollow. Eliza had hiked the trail many times as a child, but it looked different now. The air was colder here, heavier, like each step pulled at her lungs. Birds didn't sing. The wind didn't move the branches. The forest had gone still. She followed the path to the known boundary of what locals called the Hollow. a sunken stretch of forest where the trees grew too close together and the moss on the rocks bled dark. There, under a twisted maple, she found it, a marker, a stack of 7 stones perfectly balanced. She didn't touch them. Then, a rustle to her left. She froze. It wasn't an animal. No breathing, no footfall, just presence. Her fingers gripped her flashlight. And then a whisper. "Eliza." She turned, but no one was there. Only the trees, only the silence, and the feeling that something had taken a step closer. That night, 3:12 a.m., she awoke in darkness, the kind that felt heavy, not just an absence of light, but a presence in itself. Her house was quiet, too quiet. She rose and walked to the window. The trees were still. Then, across the yard, at the edge of her property, stood a boy. 15, pale, dressed in a windbreaker and jeans, smiling. Jacob. But he didn't move like a boy. He tilted his head, mechanically, like a puppet, and his eyes, empty, hollow, reflecting no light, just dark glass. She blinked, and he was gone. Next morning, the break-in. The back door was open. She hadn't opened it. On her floor was a pile of wet leaves and muddy prints, but the prints were strange, barefoot, too long, with toes that dragged like claws. She checked the journal. A new entry had appeared. "It sees you now." Later that week, visiting the hollow again. Eliza returned to the edge of the hollow. She found the same stacked stones, but now there were 8, and the soil around the marker was disturbed, like something had been dug up or buried. That's when she found the bag, a small rotted satchel half covered in moss. Inside, a rusted knife, a piece of paper with faded writing, and a photo. The photo was of Jacob Morris, but next to him, blurred and misshapen, was a tall figure in the trees. Barely visible, faceless, hands too long, and eyes, none at all. Just 2 dark pits, and yet, somehow, it stared right at her.
Chapter 4, The Hermit's Path. Part 1, Whispers Before Silence. February 17th, 1993, 6:03 p.m., Highway 7, near Briar Hollow. The snow came fast and hard that year, thick enough to bury entire memories beneath its silence. Caleb Rourke was 20 years old and spiraling fast. His father was dead. His mother had disappeared 2 months prior, leaving behind a freezer full of meat and a kitchen window left open in mid-December. She had never been found. The official story was grief, maybe suicide. Caleb didn't believe it. She had gone into the woods, just like Jacob Morris, just like the others. Now Caleb was driving through a blizzard, headlights catching the swirling snow like ghosts dancing in a tunnel. He should have stayed at the boarding house, but something had called him back. Not a sound, a pull, somewhere behind his ribs. It wasn't grief. It was direction. Then something darted into the road. A boy. Caleb swerved, tires screamed, the car flipped once, twice, then landed upside down in a shallow ditch. Metal groaned, his head struck the roof, blood leaked into the snow. He blacked out. When he came to, the boy was standing beside the wreck. Jacob Morris. Still 15, still wearing that same green windbreaker, still wrong. "You saw me," Jacob said, without moving his lips. The voice came from the woods behind him. "You crashed." Jacob said again, blinking out of sync. Caleb crawled from the wreckage, dragging a dislocated shoulder and a leg that didn't feel attached. The snow was burning hot against his wounds. He stared up at the boy. "You're not real." Jacob smiled, too wide. "Not anymore." And then he was gone. Part 2. The Hollow Speaks. Caleb limped toward the trees. It should have been suicide, alone, injured, below freezing. But he knew. He felt it. The hollow was open now. It had seen him. It had been waiting. He passed familiar signs, the bent maple near the ravine, the 3 stumps that looked like a trinity of graves. These were the places his mother used to warn him about. The hollow feeds on what's forgotten. That's why it steals the lost. He found the clearing just before midnight, a depression in the earth where no snow settled, just black soil and wet moss pulsing faintly like breath. In the center, a stone altar, old, weathered, covered in symbols too worn to read, and something moved behind it. He thought at first it was a tree shifting in the wind, but there was no wind. A tall figure, no eyes, no mouth, only a smooth, pale surface like bark over bone. It raised one hand and touched the altar. Then it spoke, not in words, in Caleb's mind. A deep pressure, a thought that was not his. One must stay. One must keep the door closed. One must feed. You saw it. Now you belong. Caleb fell to his knees. Something inside him snapped, not from fear, but from understanding. This thing, this watcher, was not a ghost or demon. It was older, hungrier, and it needed a gatekeeper. He survived the night, woke up beside the altar, his wounds half frozen but sealed. The altar was gone. Or maybe it had never been there in the daylight. But something had changed. He felt watched always, but not just by the watcher, but by the forest itself. Birds fell silent when he approached. The wind whispered in tongues he didn't understand. He returned to the world, to the town, but couldn't stay. He had been marked. For the next 30 years, Caleb wandered the borders of the hollow, building shelters, stealing supplies, and leaving offerings to keep the watchers sleeping. Books, radios, trinkets, carvings, food from every corner of Briar Hollow. It wasn't theft. It was sacrifice. And every time he tried to leave, even for a night, the forest punished him. One night, in 2001, he hid in a shed outside town for warmth. When he awoke, 3 people were gone from a nearby home. Doors wide open, dog dead on the floor. He returned to the hollow immediately. He was the cork in the bottle. Without him, the forest spilled into the world. Part 4. Blood on the Trail. October 2005, hunting season. A group of teenagers from a nearby town went into the forest to drink. 4 boys, 1 girl. Only 2 came back, terrified, scratched, blood on their clothes that wasn't theirs. They said something found them in the woods. Not a bear, not a man. It wore the face of their friend Peter, but he didn't speak, just stood, bleeding from the eyes. Then it smiled. 1 boy died in the hospital from shock. The others never spoke publicly, but Caleb knew. The hollow was testing him, seeing what would happen if it stepped a little further past the line. After that, Caleb carved sigils into the trees, made boundary markers, left symbols of protection using bones and blood from small animals. He became a myth to the people in town. But he was really just a dam holding back a flood. Part 5. The Campfire Accident. 2012. Briar Hollow Youth Camp. Caleb had warned them. He left 3 dead birds wrapped in red cloth on their doorstep, a message not to use the fire pit in the Eastern Grove. But they didn't understand. That night, the camp counselor, Amanda Green, lit the fire. The kids gathered, sang songs, told stories. At 10:13 p.m., the flames roared blue. One of the kids, 9-year-old Lily Hastings, stood up and walked into the fire. She didn't scream. She just smiled as the fire curled around her, not burning her, but absorbing her. By the time they pulled her out, she was already gone. But her body was ice cold. No burns, no marks, just gone inside. Doctors couldn't explain it. She never spoke again, never blinked, just sat in silence, staring at windows as if something waited on the other side. Her parents moved away. The campfire pit was destroyed. Caleb left a note outside the camp office the next day. "I told you, fire opens the way." Part 6. The Face in the Water. April 3rd, 2013, the day before the alarm. Caleb had gone 2 days without sleep. The forest was changing. The signs were everywhere. The silence of birds, the black fungus blooming on tree trunks like open wounds, and worst of all, the dreams. Each night, he saw Jacob, or what looked like Jacob. The boy hadn't aged a day, still wore the same green windbreaker, still smiled without blinking. But something moved inside him, just beneath the skin, like fingers pressing from within a sack. Caleb had followed him once, deeper into the hollow. That's when he saw the pool, a natural spring nestled between moss-covered boulders. The water shimmered black despite the sunlight. Jacob stood beside it and said, "She's waiting." "She?" Jacob pointed. Beneath the surface, a face floated up, white, bloated, open-eyed. Caleb screamed, stumbled backward, fell, and when he looked again, the pool was empty. No Jacob, no face, only his own reflection, and something smiling behind it. Part 7. The Return of the Dead. Caleb began marking trees in blood again. It was coming. He knew the signs. He could feel the watcher waking. The sacrifices weren't enough anymore. It wanted people again. It wanted Eliza. He'd seen her, watching from the tree line. The hollow had taken an interest. She was strong, curious, and brave. Those were the dangerous ones, the ones the hollow liked to chase. That night, as he stole from the Pine Tree summer camp, he left behind a message. Don't look in the windows after midnight. But it was already too late. The boundaries were thinning, and the hollow had chosen. Part 8. The Broken Circle. Back in the present, Eliza's home. Eliza couldn't stop staring at the photograph she found in the buried satchel. Jacob Morris, and the tall, faceless thing beside him. She did what she wasn't supposed to do. She took the photo to Sister Annalise, the town's retired nun, the one people whispered about because of the strange things she knew. Annalise took one look at the picture and whispered, "It's not wearing him. It made him." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't possess the dead. It doesn't haunt. It replaces. When people go missing in the hollow, they don't die. They become part of it." "Like vessels?" "No, like reflections, echoes.
shadows pretending to be real. It remembers every face it takes, and it sends them back. Eliza felt cold inside. Why? To make us forget what's real. Part 9. The Watcher reveals itself. Eliza returned to the woods, not because she wanted to, because she had to. Caleb had escaped custody. No signs of forced exit. The door was unlocked, his cell empty. But the journal was still there. A new page was added. The mirror breaks at dawn. Come to the altar. She packed her gear and hiked in. Flashlight, revolver, and a compass that spun wildly the moment she entered the hollow. The trees leaned in closer here. The path twisted unnaturally, and she saw things between the trunks. Jacob, but now 10 feet tall. Her mother, though she died years ago. And herself, staring back with hollow eyes and a mouth that didn't move. Then came the screams. Dozens of voices, layered, mangled, all screaming in perfect sync. Screams that came from the ground. Eliza found the altar just before dawn, and there stood Caleb, bleeding, shaking, eyes wild. "You shouldn't have come," he gasped. "Eliza," a voice whispered behind her, her own voice. She turned and saw herself standing by the trees, smiling. Part 10. The Sacrifice. Caleb grabbed her arm. "Listen to me. I tried to stop it. I tried, but I failed. It wants to trade now. Me. For you." "What the hell are you talking about?" "If I give myself to it, you walk away. It closes again. Maybe for another 30 years. No." He pressed something into her hand, a small pendant made of twine and bone. "You carry this. You never look at your own reflection in the hollow, not even once." Then he stepped onto the altar. The earth trembled. A tree nearby screamed, and from the darkness beyond, the Watcher emerged. Tall, featureless, its chest opened like a curtain, and Caleb walked into it. The moment he disappeared, the woods exhaled. The screams stopped. The trees stilled, and the hollow fell silent. Epilogue. The Price of Memory. Eliza never spoke of that night. She told the town Caleb was found dead of exposure. They buried an empty coffin. She never returned to the hollow, never looked into mirrors near the forest, never hiked beyond the marked trails. But sometimes, in the deep of night, her door creaked open. Sometimes the air turned cold without reason, and sometimes, in the glass of her bedroom window, she caught a glimpse of Jacob, still 15, still smiling, still waiting. Because the hollow never forgets, and the Watcher is always watching. Chapter 5. Final. Hollow Eyes. Part 1. The Year the Sky Forgot. Briar Hollow, October 2024. It started with the eyes. Not pain, not noise, not blood. Just people seeing things. Mrs. Aldridge, the librarian, was the first to mention it. "They're watching me from the mirrors," she whispered to her husband before gouging her eyes out with a ballpoint pen in the reference section. Then came Gary Pelton, a high school janitor. He claimed He saw himself walking out of the woods, dressed in his uniform, carrying a mop, and smiling. That same night, his body was found hanging in the auditorium, while Gary, or something that wore his face, continued showing up for work for another 4 days before vanishing. Eliza Monroe had tried to stay ahead of it, but something had changed. Caleb's sacrifice was supposed to have closed the hollow. Instead, it had bought time. Time for the Watcher to open elsewhere. And now, it wasn't just inside the woods. It was inside them. Part 2. The Children of the Reflection. It was the children who changed first. It began with a 4th grade class on a field trip. They were taken to the edge of the old campgrounds just for nature sketches, nothing dangerous. But when they returned, one child didn't blink, ever. Another refused to speak, just smiled, too wide, whenever asked a question. The strangest was Samantha Levins. She began humming a tune no one recognized, a slow, lilting melody that made dogs howl and car alarms glitch. Worse, she began drawing things. Black trees, altar stones, a face made of nothing, a head with no features, and hands with too many fingers. But the worst drawing? A mirror. And in that mirror, the whole town on fire. Part 3. The Visitors. Eliza began seeing people who weren't dead anymore. Jacob Maris showed up outside her house 3 nights in a row. Each time he stood still. No words, no breath. Only the sound of his knuckles tapping against the window. On the 4th night, he didn't come alone. The woods were full of faces. People who had gone missing decades ago. Caleb, Lily Hastings, even her mother. All of them smiling. All of them waiting. She read Caleb's final journal page, the one he must have written just before his death. They don't die. They don't decay. The hollow doesn't feed on flesh. It feeds on identity, on memory. It keeps what it steals and wears it like a mask. They're not ghosts. They're seeds. And now, they're blooming. Part 4. The Fires of Hollow Night. Halloween 2024. It began at sundown. The sky turned the color of bruised meat. Birds flew in circles until they dropped. Electronics failed. Clocks stopped. The lake began to boil. And then came the ringing. Not a sound, a pressure in every ear. The same tone, steady, eternal. People screamed, collapsed, clawed at their heads. Some tore their eyes out. Others wandered into the woods, arms limp, mouths open. They never came back. Briar Hollow was burning, not with fire, but with inversion. Time bent. Streetlights flickered with blood instead of bulbs. Buildings reshaped. Glass turned to skin. Trees bled when cut. And through it all, they came. The reflections. Walking copies of the townspeople. Each one watching, smiling, and whispering the same phrase. Do you see yourself yet? Part 5. Eliza's Descent. She ran through fire, through broken faces, through collapsing time. She ran to the one place she swore never to return to, the altar. But it was different now. No longer hidden, it had risen. Now a tower of twisted roots and black stone rising from the lake's heart, pulsing with every memory the hollow had ever devoured. At its peak stood the Watcher. No longer faceless, it wore Eliza's face now, perfectly smiling. It reached toward her. "You made this," it whispered. "You brought the story back. You named me." "I didn't," it replied. "Names are doors, and yours has always been open." Then the Watcher offered her a choice. "Take my place," it said. "One keeper for one cycle. You watch, and the rest survive." Eliza looked down, saw the town cracking, people on fire, time breaking. She saw herself standing in every mirror, window, and pool of water, every version, empty-eyed, bleeding. And then she saw Jacob, the real one, not smiling, just afraid. A boy, frozen in time, held prisoner inside the hollow, screaming with his eyes. She made her choice. She stepped forward and whispered, "I see myself now." Epilogue. The town without mirrors. Briar Hollow still stands, but there are no mirrors, no photos, no screens. Eliza is gone, officially missing. But some nights, people say you can see her walking the edge of the woods. She doesn't speak. She just watches. And sometimes she smiles. The fires never returned. The hollow went still, but no one talks about it because the Watcher never leaves. It just waits for someone new to look into the dark and say, "Is that me?"